The first time I heard metal ring against steel at dawn, I knew someone was pretending to be something they weren't. It was 5:12 a.m., that gray hour, when the sky hasn't decided what it wants to be yet. Night or morning, and the land, still breathing cool before the sun burns it dry. I was on my back porch, coffee in hand, boots damp with dew. That's when I heard it. An engine. Low. Controlled. Rolling across my ranch like it belonged there. It didn't. Tires crunching over my gravel road. Slow. Deliberate. Like they'd done it before. Like they expected no one to question it. Headlights cut through the oaks, flashing across fence posts my father set 30 years ago. Posts that were never meant to guide traffic, only to protect what was ours. And then I saw it. A black SUV. Light bar mounted on top. Decals, just official enough, if you didn't look too closely. It didn't stop. Didn't hesitate. Just drove straight through my land, like my property was a public road. Dust rose behind it. Dry. Bitter. Carrying the smell of oil and heat. I didn't wave. Didn't shout. I just watched. Because something about it felt rehearsed. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm 41. And this ranch, 87 acres outside Fredericksburg, is the only thing in my life that's never lied to me. My dad bought this land in 1989, back when it was nothing but rock and scrub. He built every fence himself, measured every boundary twice. And he taught me something I never forgot. Land doesn't forgive mistakes. You respect it, or it teaches you the hard way. I spent 12 years as a civil engineer. Traffic systems, roadway control, barrier design. I understand movement, patterns, and more importantly, I understand how people start believing something is allowed just because no one stops them. And that morning, watching that SUV glide across my ranch, I felt it. Not anger. Not yet. Awareness. Because roads don't just appear. They're created, one pass at a time, until eventually, everyone treats them like they've always been there. By day 3, it wasn't a coincidence anymore. Same time, same route, same slow crawl across my land. Sometimes the black SUV, sometimes a white pickup, magnetic badge slapped on the door. Always the same message. This land isn't just yours anymore. That afternoon, I walked the fence line, boots grinding limestone, hand tracing the wire like I'd done 1,000 times before. Nothing broken, nothing cut, no forced entry. That's when it clicked. They weren't breaking in. They were using it, like it already belonged to them. So I drove into town, and that's when I saw the sign. Willow Ridge Estates. Phase 3. Coming soon. Fresh paint. Clean lettering. A sales trailer parked just beyond the trees. And standing out front, clipboard in hand, was Vanessa Whitmore. Blonde hair pulled tight. Sunglasses too large. And that posture, that quiet confidence, that only shows up when someone thinks the rules don't apply to them. She smiled when I stepped out of my truck. Like we were already in agreement. Like this conversation had already been decided. Mr. Caldwell, she said, voice smooth, practiced. We've been meaning to talk to you about access. Access. Like my land was a hallway. Like they just needed permission to pass through it. She laid it out like it was done. Development plans. Connectivity. Community benefit. Words stacked neatly. Designed to sound reasonable. Designed to hide the truth. No one had asked me. Not once. So I told her no. And her smile didn't disappear. It changed. Sharper. Thinner. Expected. Like she'd already planned for it. You might want to reconsider, she said, tapping her clipboard. Things tend to move forward, with or without cooperation. I drove back that evening. Windows down. Dust trailing behind me. I could taste it. Feel it settle. The sun dropped low, casting long shadows across the pasture. And for the first time since I inherited that land, it didn't feel quiet. It felt watched. That night, just after midnight, I heard an engine again. Slower this time. Careful. And somewhere in the dark, I heard the faint click of a radio. That's when I knew this wasn't traffic. This wasn't convenience. This wasn't misunderstanding. They weren't passing through. They were testing the edges, pushing the line, waiting to see how far they could go before I pushed back. And what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I don't react fast. I don't react loud. But when someone starts turning my land into something it's not, I don't stop them right away. I let them build the case for me, piece by piece, until there's no way out. So if you're watching this, I want you to think about something. What would you do if someone started using your property like it already belonged to them? Would you stop them early? Or would you wait until they went too far to walk it back? Because trust me, what happened next is exactly why you never assume someone isn't paying attention. The smell of diesel lingered in the air long after the engine noise faded, like a trace that refused to disappear, and I stood there in the dark with my boots planted in the gravel, listening to the quiet settle back over the ranch in uneven pieces. I did not turn on any lights. I did not call anyone. I just let my eyes adjust, watching the faint outline of my fence line stretch out under the starlight, every post exactly where it should be, every boundary still legally mine, even if someone else was starting to pretend otherwise. By morning, the evidence was already there. Tire tracks cut through the center pasture, pressed deep into the dry soil where the grass had not fully grown back from last season. The pattern was clean, repeated, not random. Same width, same spacing, same route. I crouched down and ran my fingers along the edge of one of the tracks, feeling the compacted dirt, the way the gravel had shifted and settled under weight. Vehicles leave signatures, whether people realize it or not, and these signatures were becoming familiar. I followed them all the way to the far fence where my land met the undeveloped edge of Willow Ridge Estates, where survey flags fluttered in the light breeze like quiet warnings. The fence itself was untouched. No cuts, no damage. They were not forcing entry. They were using the open gate I kept for my own access, the one my father installed wide enough for cattle trailers and equipment. That detail sat heavy in my chest because it meant something simple and dangerous. They were counting on consistency, counting on repetition, counting on the idea that if something happens often enough, it stops feeling wrong. I spent the rest of that morning walking the property, mapping everything in my head the same way I used to map traffic flow on highway projects. Entry point, travel path, exit, time of day, speed, frequency. By noon, I had already pulled out an old notebook from my truck and started logging what I knew. Date, time, vehicle description, direction of travel. It felt almost automatic, like slipping back into a part of myself I had not used in years, the part that looks at a problem and breaks it down into systems instead of emotions. Around 2 in the afternoon, the heat settled in, thick and steady, pressing down on the land until even the wind seemed to slow. That is when they came again. This time it was the white pickup, the one with the magnetic badge slightly crooked on the door, the edges lifting just enough to show it was temporary. I stood near the barn, arms crossed, and watched it approach without moving. The driver slowed when he saw me, just a little, enough to acknowledge that I was there, but not enough to stop. The window stayed up. The engine idled low, controlled. As it passed, I caught a glimpse of a radio clipped to the dashboard, a notepad on the passenger seat, and a uniform that looked close enough to official to fool someone who did not know better. The truck rolled past me and continued down the same path as before, tires grinding softly against the gravel, leaving behind another set of tracks layered over the ones from earlier that morning. I turned slowly, following it with my eyes until it disappeared beyond the trees. And for a second, everything went quiet again except for the distant hum of cicadas and the faint creak of the barn wood expanding in the heat. That was when it clicked into place. This was not about getting through my land once or twice. This was about establishing presence, about normalizing the idea that this route existed and that it belonged to them as much as it did to me. In civil engineering, we had a term for it, something that sounded harmless on paper but carried weight in the real world. Usage creates expectation. Expectation creates entitlement. And entitlement, if left unchecked, becomes something much harder to remove. I walked back toward the house, the sun casting sharp shadows across the ground, each step kicking up small puffs of dust that hung in the air just long enough to catch the light before fading away. Inside, I pulled out my old laptop, the one I kept for project files, and set it on the kitchen table. The screen flickered to life, and for a moment I just stared at it, listening to the quiet hum of the fan and the distant echo of that engine still replaying in my head. Then I started pulling up county maps, property lines, easement records, anything that could tell me what they thought they were building toward. Because if they were going to treat my land like a road, I needed to understand exactly how far they were willing to push it. And that was when I noticed something in the records that did not add up. The county map glowed pale blue on my screen, thin black lines carving the land into neat, legal shapes that had not changed in decades, and I leaned closer, elbows on the table, staring at the boundary of my property like it might shift if I looked away for too long. The air inside the house carried that faint mix of old wood and cooled coffee, and the only sound was the soft ticking of the wall clock my father used to wind every Sunday morning. I zoomed in slowly, tracing the edge where my ranch met the proposed development, following every recorded line, every annotation, every easement mark that had been filed with the county. There were none. No access rights. No shared roadway designation. No temporary construction easement. Nothing that gave anyone legal permission to move across my land without asking me first. And yet, they were doing it anyway, twice a day now, like repetition itself was a kind of permission. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath, feeling that familiar shift in my mind from uncertainty to clarity. Because I had seen this before, just not on a ranch. On highway projects, we used to deal with disputes over access all the time. Property owners, developers, city planners, all trying to carve out pieces of movement where none existed yet. And the rule was always the same. If you could show consistent use over time without interruption, you could start making an argument for access. Not ownership, not officially, but enough to create pressure. Enough to blur lines that were supposed to stay sharp. I closed the laptop and stepped outside, the heat still lingering in the late afternoon air, cicadas buzzing in waves that rose and fell like a warning signal. I could not ignore. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked toward the gate. The same gate they had been using every time, wide open, untouched, like an invitation I never meant to give. I rested my hand on the metal latch, feeling the warmth from the sun still trapped in it, and looked out toward the path they kept carving deeper into my land with every pass. That is when I heard the engine again. Not distant this time. Closer. Louder. I turned just as the black SUV came into view, moving at that same controlled speed, the light bar on top catching the sun in a way that made it look official from a distance. It slowed as it approached me, tires pressing into the gravel with a steady crunch, and for the first time since this started, it stopped. The window rolled down halfway with a soft mechanical hum, and a man in a dark uniform leaned slightly toward me. He looked the part. Clean shirt, badge on the chest, radio clipped to his shoulder. But something was off. The badge was too polished, too generic, and the stitching on the uniform did not match any department I knew in this county. "Sir," he said, voice calm but practiced, "this route is now considered an active access point for Willow Ridge Estates. We recommend you keep this gate open for safety and continuity." Safety and continuity. The words hung in the air like they were supposed to carry authority, like saying them out loud made them real. I did not respond right away. I just looked at him, then at the vehicle, then back down the path behind him where the dust still lingered from his drive-in. I had spent years around real enforcement officers during infrastructure projects, coordinating road closures, managing detours, working side by side with people who had actual authority. This was not that. This was imitation. Close enough to fool someone who did not know what to look for, but not close enough to stand up under real scrutiny. "You have paperwork for that?" I asked finally, keeping my voice even. He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, and that was all I needed to see. "It is being processed," he said, nodding slightly as if that settled it. "In the meantime, we expect cooperation." Expect. Not request. Not ask. Expect. The engine idled low between us, a steady vibration I could feel through the ground, and for a moment the entire scene felt staged, like a performance meant to push me into reacting the way they wanted. I stepped back from the gate, letting my hand fall away from the latch, and gave a small nod. "I hear you." I said nothing more. He studied me for a second longer, then rolled the window back up without another word. The SUV eased forward, slipping past me and continuing down the same path it always took, leaving behind that same trail of dust and that same quiet assumption that nothing had changed. But something had, because now I knew exactly what they were doing. And more importantly, I knew exactly what they were not. They were not backed by law. They were not backed by any recorded right. They were building something out of repetition and appearance, hoping I would accept it before I had time to question it. I stood there for a long time after the engine noise faded, the heat pressing against my skin, the smell of dust still hanging in the air, and I looked at that open gate like it was no longer just a piece of metal, but a decision I had been avoiding. And that was when I understood what they were really counting on. The gate stayed open that evening longer than it ever should have, and I stood there watching the sun dip behind the tree line, while the shadows stretched across the gravel like quiet warnings I could no longer ignore. The metal latch felt heavier in my hand now, not because it had changed, but because I finally understood what leaving it open actually meant. It was not convenience anymore. It was permission. And permission, even silent, even unspoken, has a way of turning into something people assume they own. I closed it slowly, the hinge creaking just enough to break the stillness, and the click of the latch settling into place echoed sharper than it should have in the evening air. For a moment, everything went quiet again. No engines, no dust, just the low hum of insects and the distant rustle of wind moving through dry grass. It almost felt normal. That feeling lasted less than 12 hours. The next morning, the sound came earlier than usual. Not the steady hum this time, but a sharper approach, tires hitting gravel with more intention, more speed. I stepped outside before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the air still cool against my skin, and saw the black SUV roll up to the gate without slowing down. It stopped just short of it, engine idling louder than before, like it was announcing itself. For a second, nothing happened. Then the driver leaned slightly forward, looking at the closed gate like it was a problem that should not exist. The door opened, and he stepped out, boots hitting the gravel with a firm, deliberate sound. He walked up to the gate, reached for the latch, and tested it. It did not move. I stayed where I was, about 20 yards back, watching without saying a word. He looked over at me, just briefly, then back at the gate. There was no confusion in his expression, just irritation, like I had changed the rules without telling him. He pulled out a radio, spoke into it quietly, words I could not fully hear but could recognize in tone. Controlled, measured, performing authority. Within minutes, the white pickup arrived behind him, pulling up in a slow arc that kicked up a fresh wave of dust. Now there were two vehicles idling at my gate, both positioned like they expected the situation to resolve in their favor. The second driver stepped out, adjusting his shirt, glancing between me and the gate like he was calculating something. Neither of them approached me directly. They stayed near the vehicles, near their version of control, letting the engines run, letting the presence of those lights and uniforms do the talking. I walked forward slowly, boots pressing into the gravel with steady, even steps, and stopped a few feet from the gate on my side. No rush, no raised voice, just distance and clarity. "This gate stays closed," I said, keeping my tone level. The first man tilted his head slightly, like he had heard that before, but did not consider it final. "This is an active access route," he replied, repeating the same line as before, but there was less confidence in it now, more insistence than authority. I did not respond right away. I just looked at the vehicles, at the way they were positioned, at the path behind them where the ground had already been marked by days of repeated use. Then I looked back at him. "Not on my land," I said. The silence that followed was different this time. Not uncertain, not quiet. Tense. The kind of pause where both sides are measuring what comes next without saying it out loud. He stepped back slightly, glancing toward the pickup, then back at me. The radio crackled faintly in his hand, a low static that filled the space between us. For a moment, it looked like he might argue, might push, might try to turn words into pressure again. Instead, he exhaled slowly and turned away, walking back to the SUV. The door closed with a dull thud, and the engine revved just a little higher before he shifted into reverse. The vehicle backed up carefully, gravel popping under the tires, then turned and pulled away, the white pickup following close behind. The dust they left behind hung in the air longer than usual, thick and slow to settle, like it was carrying something unfinished with it. I stood there until the sound of the engines disappeared completely, until the quiet returned in full, and then I turned back toward the house, the weight of what just happened settling in my chest in a way that felt both expected and different. Because this was no longer just them passing through. This was them testing what they could take, and I had just given them their first clear answer. But answers like that tend to come with a response of their own. The quiet did not last, not the real kind, not the kind that means something is over, because by late afternoon the air felt different, heavier, like the land itself was waiting for something to happen next. I was in the barn checking a loose hinge on one of the stall doors when I heard it again, not just one engine this time, but two, maybe three, approaching from the direction of the main road. The sound carried differently in the heat, low and steady, and I stepped outside wiping my hands on a rag. already knowing this was not going to be like the morning. The vehicles came into view in a slow line. The black SUV in front, the white pickup behind it, and another truck I had not seen before trailing just far enough back to make the formation look intentional. They did not stop at the gate right away. They rolled up, paused, and then idled there like they were deciding how this version of the situation was going to play out. I walked toward them again, same pace, same distance, stopping a few feet from the gate with the sun dropping lower behind me, casting long shadows across the gravel. This time, the driver of the SUV stepped out immediately. No hesitation, no testing the latch first. His posture was tighter now, less performative, more direct. "We are going to need that gate opened," he said, voice firmer than before, like repetition had convinced him that tone could replace authority. I looked at him, then at the other drivers stepping out of their vehicles, spreading just enough to create presence without crossing onto my side of the fence. It was subtle, but it was there, the kind of positioning meant to make one person feel outnumbered without anyone saying it out loud. "No," I said, same tone as before, nothing added, nothing taken away. The word hung between us, simple and final, and for a moment no one moved. Then he nodded once, like he expected that answer, and reached into his vehicle. When he came back, he held a piece of paper, crisp, freshly printed, edges still sharp. He walked up to the gate and held it up just enough for me to see from where I stood. "Notice of access designation," he said, tapping the page lightly. "This route has been identified as necessary for ongoing development operations. Obstruction may result in further action." The words were there, printed clean, formatted to look official, but something about it felt off the same way his uniform did. Too neat. Too convenient. I did not step forward to take it. I did not need to. I had spent enough time around real documentation to know that real authority does not arrive without record, without process, without something that exists beyond a single sheet of paper in someone's hand. "You can leave that on your side," I said. He held my gaze for a second longer, then lowered the paper slightly, his jaw tightening just enough to show the shift from performance to frustration. "We are trying to handle this cooperatively," he said, the word cooperative stretching thin under the weight of everything that had already happened. I glanced at the vehicles again, at the engines still running, at the dust beginning to gather around their tires, and then back at him. "So am I replied. The silence that followed was shorter this time, sharper. He turned without another word and walked back to the SUV, the paper still in his hand, and climbed inside. The other drivers followed suit, doors closing one after another, engines revving slightly higher, as if the machines themselves were impatient with the situation. For a second, I thought they might try something different, push harder, test the boundary in a new way. Instead, the lead vehicle shifted into reverse again, backing away from the gate with controlled precision, the others falling in line behind it like they had practiced this retreat just as much as the approach. They pulled away slowly at first, then picked up speed once they cleared the entrance, disappearing back down the road they had come from. The dust lingered again, thicker this time, hanging in the warm air as the sun dipped lower, turning everything a shade of gold that made the scene look calmer than it felt. I stayed there until the last of the sound faded, until the only thing left was the quiet hum of the evening settling in around me. Then I turned and walked back toward the house, the gravel crunching under my boots, the weight of that paper they never left sitting heavier in my mind than if I had actually held it. Because now they had moved past pretending this was routine. Now they were trying to make it look official. And that meant the next move was not going to be quieter. The paper stayed in my head longer than the sound of their engines, longer than the dust that eventually settled back into the gravel, because something about it did not sit right no matter how many times I replayed the moment in my mind. That night, I spread out my own documents across the kitchen table, the same table my father used to balance checkbooks and review cattle records, and I let the overhead light cast a clean circle over every page. Deeds, surveys, tax records, everything tied to this land going back more than 30 years. The paper smelled faintly of age and ink, and the edges of some of the older documents were worn from being handled over time, but the lines were still clear, still precise, still legally solid. I ran my finger along the boundary descriptions, the measurements, the coordinates that defined exactly where my property began and ended. There was no ambiguity in any of it. No shared access. No conditional use. No language that could be twisted into something else if someone tried hard enough. That was the part that kept repeating in my head. They were not working with anything real. They were building something out of appearance and repetition, hoping it would harden into something they could claim later. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirp of insects outside. In my old job, when a system did not make sense, when something did not align with the data, you did not react right away. You observed. You documented. You let the pattern reveal itself before you made your move. By the next morning, I had already made a decision. I was not going to argue with them anymore at the gate. I was not going to meet performance with performance. I was going to treat this like what it really was, a system being built in front of me, one pass at a time. The first thing I did was install cameras. Not obvious ones, not the kind that would invite confrontation, but small, well-placed units along the fence line and near the gate, angled to capture entry points, vehicle paths, timestamps. I mounted them early, just after sunrise, the air still cool enough that the metal brackets did not burn my hands. The soft click of each mount locking into place felt deliberate, controlled, like laying down pieces of something that would matter later. By mid-morning, the system was live, recording quietly, storing every movement, every pass, every second of activity that crossed my land. I did not have to wait long. The black SUV returned just before noon, followed by the white pickup, same order, same spacing, like nothing had changed. This time, I did not walk out to meet them. I stayed back near the barn, within view but not engaging, letting them approach the gate and stop on their own. The driver stepped out again, checked the latch, saw it still, secured, and looked around like he expected me to appear. When I did not, he stood there for a moment longer than usual, then spoke into his radio. The second driver stayed in the truck, engine idling, the low vibration carrying across the ground. After a short pause, they both got back into their vehicles and reversed out again, leaving without a word. The pattern continued over the next few days, but it shifted. The visits became less predictable in timing, sometimes early morning, sometimes late afternoon, sometimes just after sunset when the light faded and the edges of everything softened. They were testing different windows now, different approaches, looking for a moment when the resistance might not be there, when the gate might be open again, when the routine might slip just enough for them to push through. But the gate stayed closed. Every time. And every time they showed up, the cameras recorded it, silent and precise, capturing the same vehicles, the same routes, the same behavior repeated over and over again. By the fourth day, something else changed. They stopped stopping. The black SUV rolled up to the gate, paused for less than a second, and then backed away immediately, like the driver already knew what he would find and did not need to confirm it anymore. The white pickup followed the same pattern, no attempt to get out, no attempt to speak, just a quick approach and retreat. It was efficient, calculated, and that told me more than any conversation could have. They were not trying to convince me anymore. They were documenting me, building their own version of the story, one where they could show repeated attempts, repeated obstruction, repeated denial. I stood by the fence line that evening, the sun dropping low, the sky turning a dull orange that stretched across the horizon, and I watched the last set of tire tracks fade into the distance. The air felt still, but not quiet, not the kind that settles things. This was the kind that builds pressure, because now both sides were collecting something, and only one of us was doing it by the book, and that difference was about to matter. By the end of the week, the pattern had stopped feeling like a nuisance and started looking like a strategy, and I sat there at my kitchen table watching the footage play back. On my laptop, each clip lined up in a clean sequence that told a story without anyone saying a word. The timestamps were exact, the angles consistent, the behavior repeated with just enough variation to look natural if you did not know what you were looking for. Morning passes, afternoon checks, late evening approaches. Always the same vehicles. Always the same route. Always the same assumption that time would work in their favor. I paused the video on one frame where the black SUV sat just outside the gate, the driver barely visible through the windshield, and I leaned in closer, studying the details the way I used to study traffic flow diagrams. In my old work, when vehicles repeated a movement often enough, it created something we called an informal path. Not designed, not approved, but real enough that people started treating it like infrastructure. That was the crack in the system I had been waiting for. They were not just trying to use my land. They were trying to establish it as a route. And once a route exists long enough without interruption, it becomes harder to argue that it should not exist at all. I leaned back slowly, the chair creaking under me, and let that realization settle in. Because that meant every time I had closed that gate, every time they had been forced to turn around, I had already been interrupting that process, not just resisting them, resetting the clock. The air in the room felt cooler suddenly, or maybe it was just the shift in my perspective, the way everything started to align once I understood what they were actually building toward. I let the video continue playing, watching another clip of the white pickup pulling up, pausing, and backing away without even attempting to engage. That behavior was new. That hesitation. It meant they knew something had changed, even if they had not fully adjusted yet. I stood up and walked outside, the late afternoon sun casting long, sharp lines across the ground, and I followed the path they had been using, stepping into the tire tracks that had started to fade under the wind and heat. The soil was beginning to recover, small patches of grass pushing back through the compressed lines, breaking up the pattern they had tried to imprint. That detail mattered more than anything, because if the land itself did not hold their path, neither would the law. I reached the gate and rested my hand on the top bar, the metal warm under my palm, and looked out toward the direction they always came from. The road beyond my property was quiet, empty for the moment, but that did not mean anything anymore. They would be back. They always were. The question was not if. It was how. I turned back toward the house, already thinking ahead, already shifting from observation to planning, and I could feel that old part of my mind fully awake now, the part that did not just react, but designed outcomes. In traffic systems, if you want to stop unauthorized movement, you do not argue with drivers. You change the environment. You make it physically clear where movement is allowed and where it is not, and you do it in a way that does not rely on presence or enforcement. It enforces itself. That thought stayed with me as I stepped inside and pulled out a notepad, the paper smooth under my hand as I started sketching the layout of the entrance, the width of the gate, the spacing of the fence posts, the angle of approach from the road. Measurements came back to me easily, distances in feet, clearances, turning radii, all the small details that determine how a vehicle can move through a space. I marked the entry point, then the line where the gravel met the pasture, then the exact location where their tires always cut inward to follow the same path. That was where the pressure point was. That was where the system could be changed. I paused for a moment, pen hovering over the page, and looked back toward the window, where the fading light painted the land in muted tones of orange and brown. The ranch looked the same as it always had, quiet, steady, unchanged on the surface. But underneath that, something had shifted, not just in what they were doing, but in how I was going to respond. Because this was no longer about telling them no. This was about making sure no was the only option they had left. And that meant the next step was not going to look like anything they had already seen. The measurements stayed on that page long after the light outside had faded, each line and number forming. Something more than a sketch, something closer to a solution that did not need permission to work. I sat there at the table, pen tapping lightly against the paper, listening to the quiet settle into the house while my mind ran through the same sequence over and over again. Entry point, approach angle, vehicle width, stopping distance. The details were not complicated, but they had to be exact, because when you design something to control movement, there is no room for guesswork. It either works every time, or it fails once, and everything after that becomes uncertain. I flipped to a clean page and started refining it, writing out the distances in feet, marking the spacing in inches, calculating the minimum clearance needed to prevent a standard pickup or SUV from passing through without creating an obstruction that could be legally justified. That was the key, not a barrier built out of frustration. A structure built within the rules, grounded in the same kind of standards I had spent years working with. I stood up and walked back outside, the night air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and distant cedar. The ranch was quiet again, but it did not feel passive anymore. It felt like it was waiting for direction. I walked to the gate and stood there for a long moment, looking at the ground where the tire tracks had started to fade, then at the space just beyond it where the gravel widened before narrowing into the path they had been using. That was where it needed to go, not on the gate itself, not something that could be opened or closed. something fixed, something permanent, something that defined the boundary in a way that did not require me to stand there and say no every time they showed up. I knelt down and pressed my hand into the gravel, feeling the loose stones shift under my palm, then reached for a tape measure from my belt and started marking distances, 1 point at a time. 12 feet across the entry. Standard vehicle clearance. Reduce it to controlled spacing. Enough room for my equipment, my truck, anything I needed to move through, but not enough for them to treat it like a roadway. I marked the first position with a small stake, then stepped off the next distance, placing another. Each placement felt deliberate, like laying down a line they could not cross without making it obvious. By the time I finished, the layout was clear. 3 points across the entry, spaced precisely, aligned with the approach angle they had been using. I stood up and looked at it from the roadside, imagining the path a driver would take, the moment they would realize the route no longer existed in the way they expected. That was how you stopped a pattern. You did not confront it. You removed the conditions that allowed it to continue. The next morning, I drove into town early, the sky just starting to lighten, and pulled into a supply yard I had not visited in years. The smell of cut metal and dust hit me as soon as I stepped out of the truck, familiar in a way that brought back a different version of my life, one where projects started with materials and ended with something that worked without explanation. I walked through rows of steel posts, running my hand along the surfaces, feeling the weight and finish of each one, checking dimensions without needing to read the tags. I knew exactly what I was looking for. Heavy gauge, anchored design, something that could be set deep and hold position without shifting over time. The kind of structure that did not move once it was in place. The man at the counter asked what I needed, and I kept it simple. Vehicle control posts, I said. He nodded like he had heard that before, pointed me toward a section near the back, and left it at that. No questions, no assumptions, just materials. By mid-morning, I had everything loaded into the bed of my truck, the steel resting there with a quiet weight that felt different from anything else I had brought onto this land before. This was not maintenance. This was change. I drove back slowly, the road stretching out ahead of me, the ranch coming into view the same way it always had, unchanged on the surface, but not for long. When I pulled up to the gate, I did not stop right away. I let the engine idle, looking at the space where those posts would go, the stakes I had placed still marking the exact points. The ground looked ordinary, just gravel and dirt and the faint outline of old tire tracks. But I knew better now. This was where the line would become real. And once it did, it would not be something they could argue with anymore. The weight of the steel sat in the back of my truck like a quiet promise, not loud, not urgent, but certain in a way that words never are, and I stepped out into the late morning sun knowing exactly what needed to happen next. The air was already warming up, carrying that dry Texas heat that settles in early and stays, and I grabbed the first post, feeling the solid cold of the metal against my palms before the sun had a chance to touch it. It was heavier than it looked, dense in a way that reminded me this was not something temporary, not something that could be moved aside or ignored once it was in place. I carried it over to the first marker I had set the night before and stood there for a second, looking down at the ground, at the faint indentation where the stake had been pushed into the gravel. This was where the line would start. I set the post down gently and walked back to the truck for the auger, the engine sputtering to life with a low mechanical growl that cut through the quiet. The smell of fuel mixed with dust as I positioned the drill over the first mark and let the bit bite into the ground, gravel shifting, dirt lifting, the sound steady and controlled as it carved out a clean, narrow hole. I worked slowly, not rushing, keeping the depth consistent, checking the measurement with a tape every few inches. 36 inches deep, enough to anchor it properly, enough to make sure it would not shift under pressure or time. When the hole was ready, I shut off the auger and let the silence return for a moment, broken only by the soft ticking of the engine cooling down. Then I lifted the post again, guiding it into place, adjusting it until it stood perfectly vertical, the top edge aligned with the height I had planned. I poured the first mix of concrete around the base, the powder turning to slurry as water hit it, the smell sharp and mineral, and I used a level to check the alignment again, making small adjustments until it was exact. No tilt. No give. Just straight, fixed, final. I repeated the process for the second post, then the third, each one placed at the exact spacing I had marked, each one forming part of a system that did not rely on me being present to work. By early afternoon, all three stood in place, evenly spaced across the entry, the concrete still setting around their bases, locking them into the ground inch by inch. I stepped back and wiped the dust from my hands, looking at them not as objects, but as a boundary made visible. From a distance, they did not look aggressive. They did not block the view. They simply existed, quiet and unmoving, defining where movement stopped. I walked out toward the road and turned back, viewing the setup from the same angle those drivers would see when they approached. The path they had been using was still there in shape, still visible in the ground, but it no longer connected the way it used to. The space had changed. The expectation would not match the reality anymore. That was the point. I stayed there for a while, letting the scene settle into my mind, the way the posts lined up with the gate, the way the spacing forced a decision before a vehicle could even attempt to pass through. You could not ignore them. You could not assume your way through them. You had to stop, or turn around. There was no third option. As the afternoon stretched on, the heat intensified, the metal warming under the sun, the concrete curing slowly, binding everything into place. I did not rush to test it. I did not need to. I trusted the design, trusted the measurements, trusted the same principles I had used for years to control movement on roads that carried thousands of vehicles a day. This was no different, just smaller, quieter, more personal. By the time the shadows started to lengthen again, the ranch had returned to that familiar stillness, the kind that feels earned instead of temporary. No engines, no dust, just the sound of wind moving through the grass and the distant call of a bird somewhere beyond the fence line. I leaned against the gate for a moment, arms resting on the top bar, and looked out at the road, waiting without really expecting anything yet. Because systems like this do not announce their impact right away. They reveal it the first time someone tries to ignore them. And I knew that moment was coming soon enough. The first sound came just after sunrise, that familiar low engine hum rolling in from the road before the light had fully settled across the ranch, and I was already standing near the house when I heard it, coffee still warm in my hand, watching the horizon like I knew exactly what was about to happen. The air felt still, almost too still, like the kind of quiet that comes right before something changes. I set the mug down on the porch railing and started walking toward the gate. Not fast, not slow, just steady, the gravel crunching under my boots in a rhythm that matched the approach of the vehicle. The black SUV came into view first, just like before, same path, same speed, same assumption built into every movement. For a moment, nothing about it had changed. And then it got closer. The front end dipped slightly as the driver eased off the accelerator, the vehicle rolling forward until the posts came into clear view. That was when it happened. Not a sudden stop, not a sharp reaction, just a subtle hesitation, the kind that only shows up when expectation meets something it was not prepared for. The SUV slowed to a crawl, tires pressing into the gravel as the driver adjusted, inching forward, trying to read the space in front of him. From where I stood, I could see the alignment perfectly, the way the posts narrowed the entry, the way the approach angle no longer matched the path they had been using all week. The vehicle moved a few feet closer, then stopped completely. The engine idled, steady but uncertain now, the sound carrying differently in the morning air. A second later, the white pickup appeared behind it, pulling up at a slight angle, stopping just short of the SUV like it had done every time before. But this time, there was no easy continuation, no open path, no assumption to follow. The driver of the SUV stepped out slowly, door opening with that familiar mechanical click, boots hitting the gravel with a measured pace as he walked up to the posts. He did not touch them right away. He just stood there, looking, taking in the spacing, the placement, the way they had been set with precision instead of impulse. I stayed back, near the fence line, arms relaxed at my sides, not approaching, not speaking, just watching the moment unfold the way it was supposed to. He took a step closer and reached out, tapping one of the posts lightly with his hand, like confirming it was real. The sound was solid, dull, unmistakable. Not something temporary. Not something that could be moved aside. He stepped back, glancing toward the pickup, then back at the entry, his posture shifting just enough to show the calculation happening in his head. Could he fit through? Could he angle around? Could he make it work the way it had worked before? But the space did not allow for that anymore. The design had already answered those questions before he asked them. The second driver stayed in the truck, engine idling, the faint vibration rolling across the ground, but there was no movement forward, no attempt to follow. After a few seconds, the first driver walked back to the SUV, slower this time, less certain, and got back inside. The vehicle idled for another moment, like it was waiting for a different outcome, and then the reverse lights came on. The tires shifted, gravel popping softly as the SUV backed away from the entry, turning carefully to clear the space before heading back the way it came. The pickup followed, same as always, but this time there was no hesitation in the retreat, no attempt to linger, just a clean exit like the route had never existed in the first place. I stood there until the sound of the engines faded into the distance, until the dust settled back into the ground, until the morning quiet returned in full. Then I walked forward to the posts, running my hand along the top of one, feeling the warmth of the sun starting to settle into the steel. They had not argued. They had not pushed. They had not tried to force anything. Because there was nothing to argue with. No conversation to twist. No assumption to lean on. Just a physical fact that did not change based on how someone felt about it. I stepped back and looked at the entry again, the way the post stood in line with the gate, the way the space had been redefined without a single word being spoken. This was what I had been building toward, not confrontation, not escalation, just clarity. And for the first time since this started, the pattern had broken. But the way they left told me this was not finished yet. The quiet held longer this time, stretching through the morning and into the early afternoon in a way that felt deliberate, like something was being recalculated somewhere, just out of sight. I did not assume it was over. Systems do not collapse after one interruption. They adjust. They look for another angle, another path, another way to reach the same outcome without repeating the same mistake. I spent that time reviewing the footage again, not because I needed proof anymore, but because I wanted to understand how they would respond next. The clips from that morning played back with a different weight now. The hesitation at the posts. The brief pause before the reverse lights came on. The way the second vehicle never even attempted to move forward. That was not defeat. That was assessment. By mid-afternoon, the heat settled in heavier than usual, pressing down on the land until even the wind felt slow, and I was out near the barn when I heard an engine again. But this one sounded different. Deeper. Louder. Not the controlled idle of the SUV or the pickup. This one carried more weight behind it. I walked toward the gate, wiping my hands on a cloth, and saw a larger vehicle approaching, something closer to a utility truck, with the black SUV following behind it at a distance. They were not hiding the change anymore. The truck rolled up first, stopping just short of the posts, the engine rumbling low as it idled in place. The driver stepped out, a different man this time, broader shoulders, slower movements, someone used to operating equipment rather than presenting authority. He walked up to the entry and looked at the posts without touching them, eyes tracing the spacing, the depth, the alignment. He understood what he was looking at. That much was clear. The SUV pulled up behind him, stopping at the same angle as before, but staying back, letting the new driver take the lead. I stayed where I was, near the fence line, not approaching, not engaging, just present enough that they knew I was watching. The man at the front took a step closer to the posts, then another, examining the ground around them, the concrete base, the way the gravel had settled back into place around the installation. He was not guessing. He was measuring in his head, the same way I had when I designed it. After a few seconds, he turned and walked back to the truck, opening the door, but not getting in right away. Instead, he leaned in, said something to the driver inside, then stepped back out again and looked toward the side of the entry, toward the fence line where the terrain dipped slightly before rising again. That was the only place left where someone might think they could bypass the posts, if they were willing to leave the established path and cut across uneven ground. I felt the shift immediately, the moment the problem changed shape. This was no longer about using the route I had interrupted. This was about finding a new one. The man walked a few steps in that direction, testing the ground with his boot, looking at the angle, the slope, the distance between the fence and the posts. From where I stood, I could see exactly what he was considering, the same calculations I had already run the night before when I planned the layout. That space was not an option, not for a vehicle, not without leaving clear, undeniable evidence of trespass across land that had never been used that way before. He stopped after a few seconds, looked back at the posts again, then toward the SUV, and gave a small shake of his head. Not dramatic, not frustrated, just final. He climbed back into the truck, the door closing with a solid thud, and the engine idled for another moment before the vehicle shifted into reverse. The movement was smooth, controlled, practiced, the kind of retreat that comes from understanding rather than resistance. The SUV followed, same as before, but this time there was no pause, no second look, just a clean pullback and a turn onto the road. I watched them go, the sound of the engines fading into the distance, and I stayed there a little longer than I needed to, looking at the entry, at the posts, at the ground that now held no clear path through it anymore. They had tested the system, not just the obvious route, but the alternatives, and they had found the same answer every time. There was no way through that did not break the pattern they had been trying to build. I turned back toward the house, the heat still pressing against the land, but the air felt different now, not tense, not waiting, just settled in a way it had not been before. Because this was the moment where the balance shifted fully. They were no longer setting the terms of what happened next, and that meant whatever came after this would not follow the same script. The next 2 days passed without a single engine cutting across the morning air, and that absence felt louder than anything that had come before it, like a system that had been running non-stop had suddenly been switched off without warning. I did not mistake it for victory. Silence, in situations like this, is not an ending. It is a transition. I kept my routine the same, walking the fence line at sunrise, checking the posts, reviewing the camera footage each evening, not because I expected to see something new, but because consistency mattered now more than ever. The recordings showed nothing but wind moving through grass, the occasional bird crossing the frame, and the steady stillness of the entry where the posts stood exactly as they had been set. No vehicles, no attempts, no probing from different angles, just absence. By the third morning, I drove into town again, not for materials this time, but for information. The county office sat where it always had, quiet, orderly, the kind of place where things moved slowly but accurately. The air inside carried that familiar scent of paper and climate control, and the clerk behind the counter barely looked up when I asked for access records tied to the development near my property. It took a few minutes, a few keystrokes, and then she turned the screen slightly toward me. There it was. Willow Ridge Estates. Phases mapped out. Parcels listed. Proposed access points marked clearly in red lines that stopped just short of my boundary. No extension through my land. No approved route across my ranch. Nothing filed, nothing pending, nothing even suggested in the official records. I nodded once, thanked her, and stepped back outside into the heat, the sunlight sharp against my eyes after the dim interior. That confirmed what I had already known, but confirmation matters when the next step is no longer just about understanding. It is about consequence. When I got back to the ranch, the quiet was still there, but it did not feel uncertain anymore. It felt settled, like something had been resolved without needing to be said out loud. I parked near the gate and walked up to the posts, running my hand along the steel again, the surface warm now under the afternoon sun. They stood exactly as they should, unchanged, unmoved, defining the space without effort. I looked out toward the road, half expecting to see movement in the distance, but there was nothing, just the empty stretch of gravel and the faint shimmer of heat rising off it. That was when I noticed the envelope. It sat just inside the gate, placed carefully on the ground where it would not blow away, white against the darker gravel, impossible to miss if you were looking for it. I stepped closer, picking it up, feeling the weight of the paper inside, thicker than a single sheet, more deliberate than the loose notice they had tried to show me before. There was no stamp, no official seal, just a printed name in the corner. Vanessa Whitmore. I opened it slowly, the paper sliding free with a soft sound that seemed louder in the still air. The letter inside was typed, clean, structured, but the tone had shifted. No mention of access designation. No language about ongoing operations. Just a statement of intent to pursue alternative routing for the development and a request to revisit discussions regarding potential cooperation in the future. Cooperation. The word looked different now than it had when she first said it in person. Less like an expectation, more like an option they no longer controlled. I read it once, then again, letting the meaning settle in the same way the dust had settled after every one of their attempts to pass through. This was not an apology. It was not an admission. It was a pivot, a quiet acknowledgement that the path they had been trying to create no longer existed. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope, then looked out toward the road one more time, the same way I had every day since this started. The ranch looked exactly the same as it always had. The fence line straight, the gate closed, the land undisturbed. But the difference was not in what you could see. It was in what no longer happened. And that absence told the whole story. I turned and walked back toward the house, the envelope still in my hand, the gravel shifting under my boots with each step. And for the first time since the engines had first crossed my land, the quiet did not feel temporary. It felt earned. But something about that letter told me this was not the last time I would hear her name. The envelope stayed on the kitchen table for the rest of the evening, not because I needed to read it again, but because I wanted to see how it felt sitting there without being opened, like a reminder of something that had already been decided whether they accepted it or not. The house was quiet in that familiar way, the kind that comes from routine rather than absence, and I moved through it the same way I always had, checking the back door, rinsing out a coffee mug, setting things back where they belonged. Outside, the land had already settled into night, the last of the light fading into a deep blue that stretched across the sky, and for the first time in days, there was no expectation tied to that darkness. No engine waiting to break it. No movement to anticipate. Just stillness that did not feel temporary. I stepped out onto the porch and leaned against the railing, the wood cool under my arms, and looked out across the ranch the way I had every night since this started. The fence line cut a straight path through the land. The gate stood closed, and beyond it, those 3 steel posts held their position without effort, quiet and unmoving, doing exactly what they were meant to do. They did not announce anything. They did not argue. They simply made the truth of the boundary impossible to ignore. I thought back to the first morning, the way that SUV had rolled across my land like it belonged there, the way the sound of those tires had felt out of place even before I understood why. It had not started with force. It had started with assumption. And that was the part most people miss. Real problems like this do not begin loud. They begin subtle, repeated just enough to make you question whether it is worth pushing back, whether it is easier to let it happen, whether one pass becomes 2, becomes 10, becomes something that feels normal. I let that thought sit for a moment, the night air moving gently across the porch, carrying the faint scent of dust and cedar, and I realized how close that line had been. Not legally, not physically, but mentally. Because once you accept something as normal, it becomes harder to challenge, even when you know it is wrong. That was what they had been counting on from the beginning. Not authority, not permission, just time. The next morning came the same way it always does out here, slow and steady, the sky lightening in layers before the sun clears the horizon. I was already up, standing near the gate again, coffee in hand, watching the road out of habit more than expectation. The gravel beyond the fence stayed empty, no movement, no sound, just the faint shimmer of heat beginning to rise as the day warmed up. I walked out to the posts and stood there for a moment, looking at them from the same angle those drivers had seen, the same perspective that had stopped them without a word. They had not changed overnight. They did not need to. That was the point of doing it right the first time. I reached out and tapped one lightly with my knuckles, the sound solid and quiet, and then turned back toward the house, letting the routine take over again. Days passed after that, each one quieter than the last, the pattern fully broken now, not interrupted, not paused, but ended in a way that did not invite another attempt. The cameras recorded nothing but wind and sunlight, the ground where the tire tracks had once been slowly returning to its natural state, grass pushing back through, erasing the lines that had never belonged there in the first place. And the name on that envelope never came back across my land, not in person, not in another letter, not in any form that tried to take what was never offered. I kept the envelope, though, not as a reminder of them, but as a reminder of the moment things shifted, the point where assumption met something it could not move through. Because out here, boundaries are not just lines on a map. They are choices, made clear, held steady, and enforced without needing to raise your voice. I closed the gate behind me that afternoon, the latch settling into place with a familiar click, and I paused for just a second, listening to the quiet that followed. It sounded different now. Not empty, not waiting, just right. And that was enough.